Plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and I like to have a little bit of fun as I hold Idaho media to account for some of its more obvious biases. This is going to be a little bit more of a serious tone today, simply because of what's at stake here. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, there is a bill that is passing currently through the legislature. It passed the House of Representatives recently that would prohibit gender-affirming healthcare. I'm using the media's term here, but what we're talking about is cutting off healthy body parts, otherwise retarding puberty or limiting puberty through use of drugs and hormones on minors. And I know that you'll see here in a moment, the tone that's being taken by much of the press is that, oh, this is a terrible, oppressive thing, and it's being forced on us. This is, conservative religious fanatics pushing their religious views on the rest of society. And that's kind of uniformly the way they tend to approach the problem. So I'm going to show you some of the headlines by which they portray this as, really, it's the religious fanatics, trying to impose their will on society. But before we go there, I want to put some context into this issue. And the context comes in the form of a report from the Centers for Disease Control, which indicates a 60% increase in the number of high school girls contemplating suicide. That's a pretty big deal, right? And by the way, I'm not putting that all at the feet of, this is all part of the transgender, agenda or issue. But something is going on in our society, and it's very clear that there are some very at-risk youth, but particularly high school girls seem to be falling prey to this. And, talk to people in your community, you'll probably find that there are a lot of parents who are dealing with children who either have suicidal ideation or maybe even have made plans or, heaven forbid, in some cases have acted on them. So I want to share with you a tweet. This is from the CEO of the Babylon Bee, Seth Dillon, who also points to this study and says teenage girls are suffering from unprecedented sadness and confusion. A new report from the CDC says 57% of teenage girls felt persistently sad or hopeless in 2021. Roughly 30% of them were suicidal. At the same time, we're seeing an explosion in girls identifying as boys. In some areas, as many as 1 in 10 identify as gender diverse or gender nonconforming. Now, he was called out by individuals saying, well, now, what are you trying to say? There's, some kind of causation here. You're saying that, their identity, their gender identity confusion is what's leading to this. And I want you to see the answer that he gave, because I think he really zeroes in on something important here. Seth Dillon says, I didn't make a cause-effect argument. I noted that these things are happening concurrently. There are a variety of reasons teen girls are in such dark despair. Transitioning is a social and surgical solution to a problem of our own making. We're cultivating confusion and then treating it by damaging the body to match the newly damaged mind. Wow, that is really on target. He says this doesn't make life better for teens. It will destroy countless lives if nothing is done to stop it. Thankfully, gender clinic whistleblowers are beginning to sound the alarm, and many states are presently taking action. Now, of course, Idaho being one of those states. So I'm going to share with you now a few of the headlines. And, some of these are specifically related to the, gender surgery and hormone treatment and hormone blockers for minors. Some of them have to do with the whole gender identity issue, like at the Caldwell School District. But take a look at the way that this is being framed and tell me if you don't see a little consistency, uniformity, if you will, in how this is being presented. There's judgmental language, which is your first key that someone is trying to manipulate the conclusions the public comes to as they read these headlines. Here's one from the Idaho Capital Sun. Debate gets personal as Idaho House passes trans youth medical care bill. This is actually one of the more objective headlines there. But the subheadline, a mostly party line vote sent legislation to criminalize providing youth care on to the Idaho Senate. Now, there's another way we could say this too, and that is creating a boundary around vulnerable minors so that they're not being preyed upon or otherwise subject to predatory practices by those promising, what do we call it again? Oh, gender-affirming care. Here's another headline. This one from the Idaho Press. Idaho House passes bill that bans providing transgender treatment to minors. Again, it's pretty truthful. But, it's not denying them all medical care. It's just saying they must wait until they are not minors before making those kinds of permanent life-altering decisions. Caldwell School District's proposed gender inclusivity policy put on hold. That's actually good news. I just wanted to include this one. The pressure from the public has been pretty strong. And it's funny because the Caldwell School Board was, coordinating with local police to make sure that we are going to have people behaving themselves. There were no threats of violence from parents, but there were plenty of parents who were not going to back down and otherwise be shushed and, tutted into, just shutting up and doing as they are told, like so many wayward school children. Again, the stakes are very high, and this is about why would we place boundaries around our kids in the first place? Here's another headline. Community responds to House voting to ban gender-affirming care for minors. This is KTVB emoting, and if you might guess, the subheadline, the bill would not only keep transgender youth from having surgeries, it would also bar any medications. Now, if they have appendicitis, of course they're going to have surgery. If they have cancer, they're going to have surgery. This is barring doing unalterable surgeries or irreversible surgeries on minors. And to call it gender-affirming care, you can imagine what the community that KTVB spoke to was saying was all about. Pretty much to a person, it was, well, if you don't allow this to happen, these kids are just going to kill themselves. That's the threat. If you don't do this, you're looking at a bunch of suicided teens. In fact, one of the transgender individuals who was interviewed for the story just said, well, I'm just going to have to leave Idaho. That's a perfectly valid choice. But don't make it about, if it's because the people in Idaho wouldn't remove the boundaries around their own children and accommodate me. You don't have a right to impose your fantasy on other people. And I'm sorry if that offends people, it's what we're dealing with is someone who is not seeing reality as it pertains to themselves. And so it's not fair to ask the rest of society, please be included in my delusion, or rather, this is kind of the fantasy version of bake the cake. You will address me by my pronouns. You will acknowledge that I really am, whatever I think I am. I think it's perfectly possible to see a person who needs help and to be compassionate toward that person and not inflict greater suffering on them without, at the same time, saying, okay, I'll turn loose of reality and play along. One more headline here. Idaho House votes to ban most gender-affirming care for minors. Again, this is from KTVB. The penalty for a health professional providing gender-affirming care, that's surgical mutilation of healthy body parts for a minor, is up to 10 years in prison. I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing either. I think this should be discouraged. Now, oftentimes, and KTVB, I think, is one of the ones leading out on this, they'll say, well, we've talked to people within the trans community, and they have said that this was exactly what they needed. And you don't hear much from people who've actually worked within the so-called gender-affirming care industry until now. And this is what I wanted to share with you that I think is worth your consideration. It may not change your mind. That's okay. But I'm going to ask you to consider the point of view of this individual. Her name is Jamie Reed. She says, I thought I was saving trans kids. Now I'm blowing the whistle. There are more than 100 pediatric gender clinics across the U.S. Jamie worked at one, and she says what's happening to children is medically and morally appalling. Now, before you start thinking, oh, so she's another one of those right-wing, religious fanatics. No, listen to her background. She says, for almost 4 years, I worked at the Washington University School of Medicine Division of Infectious Diseases with teens and young adults who were HIV positive. Many of them were trans or otherwise gender nonconforming, and she says I could relate. Through childhood and adolescence, I did a lot of gender questioning myself. I'm now married to a trans man, and together we're raising my 2 biological children from a previous marriage and 3 foster children we hope to adopt. Okay, she's someone who has actually walked the walk and can see things from the point of view of some of those who have, gender identity issues. All that, she says, led me to a job in 2018 as a case manager at the Washington University Transgender Center at St. Louis Children's Hospital, which had been established a year earlier. The center's working assumption was that the earlier you treat kids with gender dysphoria, the more anguish you can prevent later on. This premise was shared by the center's doctors and therapists. Given their expertise, she says, I assumed abundant evidence backed this consensus. Now, she left the clinic in November of last year because she says, I could no longer participate in what was happening there. And she says by the time she departed, she was certain that the way the American medical system is treating these patients is the opposite of the promise we make to do no harm. Instead, we're permanently harming the vulnerable patients in our care. Jamie says, today I'm speaking out, and I'm doing so knowing how toxic the public conversation is around this highly contentious issue and the ways that my testimony might be misused. She says, I'm doing so knowing that I'm putting myself at serious personal and professional risk. In fact, she says almost everyone in her life advised her to keep her head down. But she says, I cannot in good conscience do so, because what's happening to scores of children is far more important than my comfort. And what is happening to them is morally and medically appalling. Now, Jamie points out, at first the patient population was tipped toward what used to be the traditional instance of a child with gender dysphoria, which means a boy, often quite young, who wanted to present as or who wanted to be a girl. Until 2015 or so, a very small number of these boys comprised the population of pediatric gender dysphoria cases. Then, across the Western world, there began to be a dramatic increase in a new population. Teenage girls, many with no previous history of gender distress, suddenly declared they were transgender and demanded immediate treatment with testosterone. Certainly, she says, I saw this at the center. One of my jobs was to do intake for new patients and their families. So she says when she started, there were probably 10 such calls a month. When she left, there were 50, and about 70% of the new patients were girls. Sometimes clusters of girls arrived from the same high school. Do you hear what she's saying here? Wow, what a coincidence. It would all be girls from the same school. She says, this concerned me, but I didn't feel I was in the position to sound some kind of alarm back then. There was a team of about 8 of us, and only one other person had brought up the kinds of questions that I had. Anyone who raised doubts ran the risk of being called a transphobe. Now, frequently, she says, our patients declared they had disorders that no one believed they had. So they had patients who said they had Tourette's syndrome, but they didn't. Or that they had tic disorders, but they didn't. Or they had multiple personalities, but they didn't. Now, listen to this next part. The doctors privately recognized these false self-diagnoses as a manifestation of social contagion. That's a phrase you're going to want to remember. She says they even acknowledged that suicide has an element of social contagion. But Jamie says, when I said the clusters of girls streaming into our service looked as if their gender issues might be a manifestation of social contagion, the doctors said gender identity reflected something innate. But they took it a little further from there. Now, she says to begin transitioning, these girls needed a letter of support from a therapist, usually one we recommended, who they had to see only once or twice for the green light. To make it more efficient for the therapists, in fact, she says we offered them a template on how to write a letter in support of transition. The next stop was a single visit to the endocrinologist for a testosterone prescription. That's all it took. I mean, it's not like, wow, you really gave this some serious thought. Couple of perfunctory things, dot a couple of I's, cross a couple of T's, check these boxes, boom. There you go. Now, she does point out there are rare conditions in which babies are born with atypical genitalia, cases that call for sophisticated care and compassion. But she says clinics like the ones where she worked are creating a whole cohort of kids with atypical genitals. And most of those teens haven't even had sex yet. They have no idea who they're going to be as adults, but all it took for them to permanently transform themselves was 1 or 2 short conversations with a therapist. Besides teenage girls, another new group was referred to us, and that is young people from the inpatient psychiatric unit or the emergency department of St. Louis Children's Hospital. Now, she says the mental health of these kids was deeply concerning. There were diagnoses like schizophrenia, PTSD, bipolar disorder, and more. Often they were already on a fistful of pharmaceuticals. This was tragic but unsurprising given the profound trauma some of them had been through. Yet no matter how much suffering or pain a child had endured or how little treatment and love they had received, our doctors viewed gender transition, even with all the expense and hardship it entailed, as the solution. Things came to a head at a half-day retreat in the summer of 2022. In front of the team, the doctors said that she and her colleague had to stop questioning the medicine and the science, that sound familiar, as well as their authority. Then an administrator told us we had to get on board or get out. And Jamie says it became clear that the purpose of the retreat was to deliver these messages to us. In the past 15 years, she says, according to Reuters, the U.S. has gone from having no pediatric gender clinics to more than 100. A thorough analysis should be undertaken to find out what's been done to their patients and why, and what the long-term consequences are. Now, there's a clear path to follow. She says just last year, England announced that it would close the Tavistock's Youth Gender Clinic, then the NHS's only such clinic in the country, after an investigation revealed shoddy practices and poor patient treatment. Sweden and Finland, too, have investigated pediatric transition and greatly curbed the practice, finding there is insufficient evidence of help and danger of great harm. Now, does she sound like someone who's just out to score political points? Does that just sound like somebody who's, trying to, to score likes or views on Twitter? That sounds to me like somebody who's genuinely concerned. And she finishes up her article. It's worth your time to look at the article. She says, look, this is equated to building an airplane while it's in flight. Now, think about what that would entail. It's doctors that she worked with refer to it as, well, this is still kind of an experiment that is underway. But experiments are supposed to take place with safety precautions built in, and especially where it's medicine, the safety precautions to do no harm to the patients. You would think that would be an extremely high priority. But instead, she says it's like building an airplane while it's flying, and she says that is not a place that anybody should be putting their children, because we just don't know enough about where this is headed. So, for what it's worth, that's one other side of the story that you're not going to be hearing from most of the highly sympathetic, woke media sources. It just doesn't compute for them. All they can see is that, you're being unreasonable, or worse, you're trying to impose your, religious values on everybody else. Really, by refusing to allow the woke to impose their values on my child, somehow that's me imposing my values on the rest of society. It's not. What it is me, and by extension, other parents, and by extension, other people within the community asserting and actually codifying now that there are boundaries around our children that must not be crossed. That's perfectly within a parent's prerogative. It's sad that it's to the point now that we have to actually look for official, legal standing and legal ramifications for those who would dare cross that line. But at the same time, would you ask a few further questions? And this is for members of the media. Why is it so important that children be allowed to make these kinds of life-altering decisions that cannot be undone? Why is that so important? And why does it always seem to come back to, these kids need to have access to, sex change operations. They need to have access to these hormone blockers and puberty blockers. They need to have access to each other's restrooms. They need to have access to pornographic material in their school libraries. And anybody who raises an alarm and says, whoa, not for my kids, or that's crossing a line, is accused of, well, you just want to censor, or you just want to cancel anybody that you don't agree with. No, it's about establishing proper boundaries, and those boundaries are there for a reason. There comes a point for all of us where we reach an age of accountability where we are able to contract and make those kinds of decisions for ourselves. Now, age 18 is that age for most of us. For some things, smoking, drinking, and whatnot, it goes to age 21. But the bottom line is a developing child is not afforded all of the full decision-making responsibilities that adults are. Why wouldn't we uphold that standard and maintain those boundaries in these kinds of cases? Notwithstanding, the woke imperative to you accept anything that we tell you to accept, or you're being hateful. See, I see no hate in this. I see some sadness. And frankly, for the parents who have to deal with this and whose children are going through this kind of confusion, I have no doubt that the sadness and the confusion and the despair that they're feeling is very real. I come back to the idea that, a 60% increase in high school girls thinking and contemplating suicide, something is very, very broke. And I'm not just trying to assign blame, and it's all part of this, gender dysphoria agenda. Certainly, I think that can play into it. There may be other factors as well. I think you could take a really strong look at social media and look at the ways that it mimics addictive substances and addictive practices. I mean, when a kid goes onto social media, I assume this is true for adults as well. Your dopamine centers, your pleasure centers in your brain get a release. Somebody likes something that you post. Somebody shares something you posted. Somebody comments on it. Whoa, I've been noticed. I've been affirmed. Somehow somebody has actually validated me. And yet you want to go back and get more of it. And the biggest test of this, and by the way, I'm very guilty of this myself. When I first wake up in the morning, first thing I do is roll over and grab my phone. Anything interesting happened while I was asleep that I need to know about? And it's looking for that little hit of dopamine to get things started. And in talking about this, and looking, I'm not saying therefore we ought to ban it and by law we should keep kids, from accessing social media, but maybe it's time to consider some of those boundaries. I mean, it reminds me a lot of some of the cases that I've heard explained regarding pornography addiction. Pornography, likewise, activates the pleasure, the reward center of the brain. And yet, you talk to someone who has been a porn addict, and they will tell you, no matter how good things may be going in their life, when they indulge in that addiction, their sense of worthlessness spikes. That doesn't seem very healthy, does it? Just like a kid looking at social media nonstop and seeing all those perfect lives that everybody else has, suddenly starts to question their own self-worth. Now, maybe it's a bit of a stretch, comparing social media to pornography, but in a sense, they're both education systems, and both of them offer a distorted view of life. So most of the boundaries we should be setting, I think, are personal boundaries. That means we got to kind of be willing to look at, okay, what am I doing in my life that's unhealthy? And willing to realistically evaluate those things, and where necessary, make those changes. But parents, we have a responsibility to look out for our kids' well-being in maintaining and establishing, if necessary, those boundaries for their health and their safety as well. I don't know why the push is on so strong to sexualize everything about kids. Why do we want guys dressed in lingerie dancing in front of children? Why is that an important thing? Why do we want them reading library books to them? Why do we want books in our libraries explaining all the various deviant sexual practices and encouraging kids to explore them for themselves? There are things that are appropriate for kids, and there are things that aren't. And parents, when people in positions of authority start to impose those things, or worse, try to sneak them in under the radar, you are absolutely within your right to call them out and to assert those boundaries. So, with that said, let's move on to a little bit less deep topic, something that's not quite as fraught with emotion and with the accusations of you're just trying to impose your hatred on everybody. Let's talk a little bit about a voucher bill that was passed recently here in the state of Idaho. Oh, I'm sorry, they didn't call it the voucher bill. Actually, Brad Little had the Idaho Launch Bill. It passed, I think, by one vote through one of the houses of the legislature. But wow, he's so excited about it. This is a proposal that would connect students with good jobs by giving them vouchers, state money, to help them get the skills that they need. So here's a quick little news clip of Governor Little and Lieutenant Governor Bedke out there taking it to student body to see what the students' reaction was. Check it out.
I just think it's a game changer. We're building the platform for you to succeed.
Idaho Launch would help high school students pay for their post-secondary education, like college or trade school, for in-demand career fields.
This is a long-term investment in our kids. It will continue to keep Idaho kids in Idaho jobs.
Yes, the long-term investment. Spending other people's money through the form of taxes, yes, it's an investment. But it's a handout, and it benefits, certain well-connected people who politically, want to support the governor. It doesn't change the fact that, look, if you're okay with this kind of voucher, why don't you approve of choice for parents who also have kids within the public schools who may be looking for a better way to educate their kids in their primary education? Nonetheless, it's still other people's money. So regardless of whether, the governor and the lieutenant governor are calling it an investment, it amounts to, they're out there doling out favors that they didn't really earn themselves. I like how Brian Allman put it. He just says, you mean you ask teenagers if they want free money? Right. I can only guess what the answer would be in that case. Nonetheless, this is one of the reasons why we have to keep a very close eye on what's happening within the legislature. Again, I want to recommend, if you want to know what's happening, if you want to know how do various measures score in terms of increasing the size and scope of government, in terms of increasing the costs associated with government, and in terms of how they impact your freedom, go to idahofreedom.org. You'll find the Idaho Freedom Foundation does a marvelous job of tracking each and every bill, as well as keeping track of how legislators perform. Now, some legislators don't like this. In the last episode, we shared from one former legislator, one former state senator, who really had some heartburn about how dare they grade me. But if you're going to talk like you're a conservative in order to get elected, and you're going to talk like a limited government advocate in order to get elected, don't be surprised if someone calls you out when your actions show you as anything but a conservative in how you govern. I mean, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but you're really not going to fool everybody when someone is paying attention. And thank goodness there are organizations like the Freedom Foundation that are doing exactly that. All right, one final thing, just a quick laugh. One thing I do love about the media is how seriously it takes itself and how angry they get when someone calls out their lack of objectivity. Oh, the impertinence that someone would question such a thing. Don't you know that journalism is the only reason that anything good in this country exists? Because we are here to deliver the news to you in a crisp, upbeat fashion. Okay, good enough. I have to share with you one of my favorite retorts to a comment that was made by a journalist. And you got to see this to believe it. The journalist is saying, journalism can change your damn life. Yet most people spend more on a cold brew than they spend for journalism. What a beautiful response. My beer doesn't lecture me about how important it is. Maybe a little something to keep in mind there. We all tend to take ourselves too seriously from time to time. Think for yourself. Pay attention to what's going on. Don't be afraid to ask questions. But above all, if it's time to establish boundaries and place those boundaries around your kids, do not let anybody tell you that it's not your right to do so, that you have no reason to do so. If they're protesting it, there may be kind of an ulterior motive at play. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.